This is completely unacceptable work. Are you even trained?
Look at her face. She's
Gonna cry. I told you exactly how to do this, but you can't seem to follow simple instructions. Maybe this job is too difficult for you.
To the board at St. Jude's premiere, Kira Davies was a ghost in light blue scrubs, a diversity hire who spent 8 months enduring the sharp edges of their silence and the weight of their assumptions. They saw a woman who bowed her head and spoke in whispers, never suspecting that those same steady hands had once clamped femoral arteries by the light of burning flares in the most dangerous corners of the underworld. They mocked the mouse with the tight bun and the defensive clipboard, completely unaware she was the only person on Earth who had ever brought Yoon Hyuk-Jin, the iron-fisted dragon of the Korean syndicate, to his knees in devotion. Their laughter was destined to die the second the hospital windows began to rattle from the downwash of a military-grade helicopter, screaming through restricted airspace to reclaim the woman they had dared to break. The fluorescent lights of the surgical wing buzzed with a sharp, sterile hostility, the kind of sound that grates on the nerves until you want to scream. It was 3 a.m., the hour when hospital hierarchies become weapons and professional courtesy disappears. Kira stood by the trauma bay, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped her clipboard to her chest like a piece of armor. She stood in the center left of the room, her shoulders drawn inward, trying to become small enough to disappear. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare, her eyes were wet with a frustration she refused to let fall. "Look at her," sneered the head nurse, standing back with the rest of the staff who watched like spectators at a Roman circus. "She looks like she's about to faint just from the smell of antiseptic. Did we hire a nurse or a porcelain doll?" Dr. Sterling Vance didn't even look up from his patient chart, his posture radiating a performative, aggressive dominance. He leaned into Kira's personal space, his hand gripping her shoulder with a force that wasn't comforting, but controlling. "She's a placeholder, a box checked on a human resources form." Vance snapped, his mouth twisted in a condescending sneer. He leaned closer, his voice loud enough for the entire wing to hear. "I asked her for the talk screen on the Diplomat 10 minutes ago, and she just stood there looking at me with those wide, useless eyes. It's pathetic, Kira. You're lucky I don't have you cleaning the floors instead of touching my patients. You're here to fill a quota, not to think. Do you understand?" Kira didn't answer. She only clutched her clipboard tighter, the secret within it, and a man coming for her, about to detonate their world. Kira didn't look up as Dr. Vance's footsteps finally receded, the rhythm of his expensive Italian loafers clicking against the linoleum like a countdown to her own disappearance. She remained frozen, her fingers digging into the edges of her clipboard, the plastic biting into her palms. The sting of his words, quota, placeholder, useless, was a familiar weight, one she had deliberately invited when she traded the chaos of the shadows for the sterile, soul-crushing quiet of St. Jude's premiere. As she reached up to touch the tight, utilitarian bun at the nape of her neck, her mind slipped through the cracks of the present. The hum of the hospital's HVAC system transformed into the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery fire. The scent of antiseptic was replaced by the metallic tang of old blood and the heavy, humid air of a humid Seoul basement. 3 years ago, Kira hadn't been a diversity hire to be managed. She had been the Black Ghost, a name whispered in the darkest alleys of Itaewon. She lived in a world where medical licenses didn't matter, but the speed of a suture did. She remembered the night she had first met Hyuk-Jin. He hadn't come to her in a suit. He had been dragged into her makeshift clinic, his white shirt soaked crimson, a jagged blade wound threatening to drain the life from the man the city feared most. While his enforcers had paced the room like caged tigers, their hands hovering over concealed weapons, Kira had moved with a supernatural stillness. She hadn't bowed her head then. She had stood over the dragon of the East, her natural hair wild and free, her eyes fierce as she barked orders to men who could have ended her with a snap of their fingers. "Hold him down," she had commanded, her voice a low, steady anchor in a sea of violence. She had operated by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp, her hands never trembling as she navigated the delicate map of veins and muscle. Hyuk-Jin had watched her through a haze of pain, his dark eyes tracking the precision of her movements. In that underground sanctuary, she wasn't invisible. She was a god of life in a temple of death. But the shadow world extracted a price. The adrenaline had eventually curdled into a bone-deep exhaustion. She had seen too many boys with holes in their chests, and too many mothers weeping in the dark. When Hyuk-Jin had finally consolidated his power, clearing the path for a peace built on his own absolute dominance, he had offered her a throne. Instead, she had asked for a ghost life. "I want to go home," she had told him, her hand resting on the dragon tattoo that now arched across his healed shoulder. I want a life where I don't have to wash blood off my shoes every morning. I want to be someone who doesn't matter. He had let her go, but only with the promise of his ring. A 5-carat weight she currently wore on a silver chain tucked beneath her light blue scrubs, resting right against her heartbeat. To hide from that past, she had created the persona of the mouse. She tucked her hair into a bun so tight it felt like a mask. She practiced rounding her shoulders and lowering her gaze, learning to stutter over medical terms she could recite in her sleep. She allowed men like Vance to believe they were her superiors, because the alternative, being the woman who knew how to kill as efficiently as she knew how to heal, was a burden she no longer wanted to carry. A sharp bark of laughter from the nurse's station snapped Kira back to the present. Sarah was still watching her, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. Kira let her shoulders slouch an inch lower, the invisible medic once again taking her place. She forced herself to look small, to look broken, even as her heart hammered against the cold metal of the ring hidden beneath her uniform. She was playing a role, but as the 2 a.m. darkness pressed against the hospital windows, she felt the first stirrings of a storm. The mouse was still there, but the ghost was beginning to wake up. The heavy double doors of the ambulance bay burst open with a violence that shattered the stagnant hospital air. Usually, the 3 a.m. arrivals were predictable, intoxicated stumbles or standard chest pains, but this was different. 6 men in dark, tailored suits flooded the hallway first, their presence as sharp and intrusive as a blade. In their wake came the gurney, surrounded by a swarm of paramedics who looked uncharacteristically shaken. "We have a high-priority transfer," one shouted, his voice cracking. Ambassador Moretti, found unresponsive at a private gala. Unexplained neurological collapse. Dr. Sterling Vance appeared instantly, his white coat fluttering like a cape as he assumed his position at the head of the bed. He loved the spotlight of a high-profile case. It was the theater he lived for. "Clear the bay. Sarah, get the intubation kit. This is a standard ischemic stroke. Look at the facial drooping. Prepare for TPA administration immediately." The ER erupted into a chaotic dance of panic. Nurses scrambled. Machines began their rhythmic, high-pitched screaming, and Vance barked orders with a frantic desperation disguised as authority. In the corner of the room, Kira stood perfectly still, while the others were blinded by the ambassador's status and Vance's loud declarations. Kira's eyes were locked on the patient's hands. Moretti's fingers weren't limp. They were curling in a specific, rhythmic tremor. She stepped closer, her shadow falling over the bed. She noticed a pinprick of a bruise just behind his ear, and the way his pupils weren't just dilated, but fixed in a way that had nothing to do with a stroke. The mouse mask slipped for a fraction of a second. Her mind raced back to a windowless room in Seoul where she had seen this exact physiological signature before. It wasn't a stroke. It was a signature. "Dr. Vance," Kira said. Her voice was low, but it held a strange, resonant frequency that momentarily cut through the shouting. Vance didn't even turn his head. "Not now, Kira. Get out of the way before you trip over a lead. I'm trying to save a life." "It's not a stroke, doctor," she persisted, stepping into the light. She pointed to the ambassador's neck, where a faint, lace-like pattern of broken capillaries was beginning to bloom beneath the skin. "Look at the livido reticularis on the neck. And meiosis. If you give him TPA, you'll cause a systemic hemorrhage. He won't survive the infusion." Vance stopped, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He turned on her, his chest puffing out. "Are you diagnosing my patient now?" A nurse who can barely handle a cardiac intake is telling a chief resident how to read a neurological event? "It's a stroke, Davies. Move. Now." "It's V-series neurotoxin," Kira whispered, her voice tightening with the weight of the truth. "It's been weaponized to mimic a cardiovascular event. He needs a high-dose atropine oxym cocktail, not blood thinners." The room went silent. The staff stared at Kira as if she had started speaking a dead language. Sarah let out a jagged, mocking laugh. "V-series? What? Did you watch a spy movie on your break, Kira? Get back to the station." Vance leaned in, his shadow looming over her. "One more word of medical interference, and I will have security drag you out of this building. You're a nurse. Your job is to fetch the tray, not to think. Do I make myself clear?" Kira looked down at her clipboard, her knuckles white. She could see Moretti's chest beginning to hitch, the first sign of respiratory paralysis. The arrogance in the room was a physical barrier, a wall of ego that was about to kill a man. She looked at the men in suits standing by the door. They were watching her now, their eyes narrowing. They recognized the term she had used. She felt the 5-carat ring beneath her scrubs growing warm against her skin. The mouse wanted to stay silent, to survive the shift and disappear. But the ghost knew that in exactly 90 seconds, Ambassador Moretti's heart would stop, and Vance's pride would be the cause of death. She took a single, steady breath, her shoulders squaring as she prepared for the moment the mask would have to break. The air in the trauma bay grew thick, charged with the kind of volatile energy that precedes a terminal mistake. Dr. Sterling Vance didn't just ignore Kira's warning. He treated it like a personal insult to his lineage. He stepped so close to her that she could smell the stale espresso on his breath and the metallic scent of his arrogance. "You have exactly 5 seconds to get out of my sight before I have security physically remove you from this floor," Vance hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet rage. He turned back to the monitors, his eyes manic. "Sarah, the TPA. Now, we're losing the window for clot busting." Kira watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, as Sarah snapped the seal on the powerful thrombolytic. The staff moved with a blind, practiced efficiency, falling in line behind the loudest voice in the room. They were so conditioned to Vance's authority that they couldn't see the man on the table was no longer breathing. He was suffocating. "Doctor, look at his jaw," Kira said, her voice abandoning its soft, rhythmic lilt and taking on a sharp, clinical edge. "The masseter muscle is seizing. It's a cholinergic crisis, not a stroke. If you push that medication, his blood won't be able to clot when his lungs eventually fail. You are signing his death warrant." Vance didn't even look at her. "Push it," he commanded. As the clear fluid began to snake its way down the 4 tubing toward Ambassador Moretti's vein, the room seemed to tilt. Kira felt the weight of the black ghost rising within her, the woman who had seen men die in the mud because of the pride of generals. She saw the ambassador's monitor begin to scream. The heart rate plummeted, the oxygen saturation numbers tumbling into the deep reds. "He's crashing," Sarah yelled, the mockery finally drained from her face, replaced by the jagged panic of someone who realized they were out of their depth. "It's a secondary embolus," Vance shouted, his hands shaking as he grabbed the defibrillator paddles. "Charge to 200. Everyone back. It's not his heart." Kira's voice rang out, no longer a whisper, but a command that momentarily froze the room. "You're paralyzing him from the inside out." Vance ignored her, slamming the paddles onto Moretti's chest. The body jolted, a violent, artificial arc, but the flat line on the monitor remained a mocking, horizontal ghost. Vance charged again, his face slick with sweat, his mask slipping to reveal the desperate boy beneath the surgeon's gown. He was no longer trying to save a patient. He was trying to save his reputation. "I said charge to 300. Vance screamed at the crash cart nurse. Why isn't he responding? Blood began to trickle from the ambassador's nose, a direct result of the TPA Vance had insisted on. The neurotoxin was winning, aided by the very man sworn to fight it. The high-priority suits by the door shifted, their hands moving toward their waistbands, their eyes fixed on Vance with a lethal intensity. They knew. Kira stood at the edge of the chaos, her eyes darting to the supply cabinet where the atropine was kept. She saw the life fading from Moretti's face, the gray ashen pallor she had seen 100 times in the shadow world. Vance was lost in a spiral of ego and error, his hands fumbling with the paddles as he prepared a third, useless shock. The mouse was gone. Kira Davies, the nurse who took up no space, died in that moment. In her place stood a woman who knew that the only thing more dangerous than a toxin was a man who couldn't admit he was wrong. She looked at the clock. Seconds remained before the ambassador's brain would starve for good. She didn't look at Vance as she stepped toward the medication tray. She looked at the patient, her hands finally regaining the supernatural stillness of the woman who had once tamed the dragon of the East. The monitor emitted a final, terrifyingly long, flatline tone. Dr. Sterling Vance stood frozen, the heavy paddles still pressed against the ambassador's chest, his knuckles white as he waited for a miracle that his own arrogance had blocked. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, metallic scent of the blood, now trickling from the patient's nose. Kira didn't wait for a command. She moved with a sudden, fluid grace that felt entirely foreign to the woman who had spent months shrinking into the shadows. She bypassed the secondary crash cart and reached for the high-dose atropine oxym vials she had pre-staged in her mind. "What are you doing?" Sarah shrieked, her voice cracking under the pressure of the impending death. "Kira, step away. You aren't authorized." Kira ignored her, her focus narrowing until the only thing that existed was the foreport and the dying man. With a hand that possessed the supernatural stillness of the black ghost, she snapped the glass vials and drew the clear liquid into a syringe. "Davies!" Vance roared, finally snapping out of his trance. He dropped the paddles, the heavy cables swinging like a pendulum. "If you touch that line, I will have you charged with assault. Step back. That is an order." Kira looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time, Vance saw the fire he had tried to extinguish. It wasn't the look of a nurse. It was the look of a commander. "Then charge me," she said, her voice a low, vibrating blade. "But I won't watch you kill him because you're too proud to be wrong." Before Vance could reach her, Kira's thumb depressed the plunger. She pushed the antidote with a steady, relentless pressure. For 5 agonizing seconds, the room was a vacuum of silence, broken only by the hum of the cooling defibrillator. Then, the ambassador's body convulsed. A deep, rag gasp tore from his throat, the first true breath he had taken in minutes. The flat line on the monitor buckled, jumping into a frantic, disorganized rhythm before smoothing out into a strong, rhythmic gallop. The gray, ashen tint of his skin began to recede, replaced by a flush of returning life. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Vance's humiliation. He stood over the bed, his chest heaving, looking at the monitors that proved his diagnosis had been a death sentence. The men in suits by the door relaxed their grip on their concealed weapons, their eyes shifting from the patient to Kira with a look of profound, silent recognition. Vance's face turned a mottled, bruised purple. He couldn't process the life saved. He could only feel the sting of his authority being stripped away in front of his subordinates. "You're done," Vance whispered, his voice shaking with a pathetic, petty rage. He pointed a trembling finger toward the exit. "You performed an unauthorized medical procedure against the direct orders of a chief resident. You violated every protocol in this hospital." "I saved his life, Sterling," Kira said, her voice weary as she stripped off her gloves with a sharp snap. "You're fired, Davies." "Effective immediately," he spat, leaning into her space one last time, trying to reclaim the dominance he had lost. "I want you out of my ER. I'm calling security to escort you from the premises. I'll make sure you never hold a needle in this city again. You're nothing but a liability." The staff watched in a stunned, complicit silence as 2 security guards entered the bay. They didn't look at Kira's face. They looked at the floor, unwilling to acknowledge the heroism they had just witnessed. Kira didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply took her clipboard, held it to her chest one last time, and allowed the guards to lead her toward the automatic doors. As she stepped out into the cool night air of the ambulance bay, the mouse was officially dead. She stood on the curb, the silence of the hospital behind her and the cold weight of the ring on the chain against her heart. She looked up at the moonless sky, hearing a distant, rhythmic throb that wasn't a heartbeat. It was a bone-shaking growl, the sound of a predator approaching from the clouds. The ghost was free, and the dragon was coming to claim her. The cold night air of the hospital parking lot bit through Kira's thin scrubs, but she didn't feel the chill. She stood on the curb of the bus stop. The weight of her termination let her folded in her pocket like a death warrant. For 8 months, she had lived as a shadow, absorbing Dr. Vance's vitriol and the staff's quiet complicity, all for the sake of a peace that had finally shattered. She reached into her collar, pulling out the silver chain to touch the heavy diamond ring. It felt like a beacon, glowing against the dark fabric of her soul. The silence of the early morning was suddenly obliterated. It began as a low, subsonic vibration in the asphalt, a rhythmic thrumming that rattled the glass of the bus shelter. Kira didn't flinch. She looked up. Far above the city skyline, a shape darker than the midnight sky detached itself from the clouds. It was a massive, matte black military transport, its navigation lights extinguished in a blatant act of defiance against civil aviation laws. The roar grew into a bone-shaking scream as the helicopter banked sharply, its rotors cutting through the air with the sound of tearing silk. It didn't circle for a landing pattern. It dropped like a predatory bird toward the roof of St. Jude's Premier. Back inside the hospital, the windows of the ER vibrated with such force that a tray of instruments clattered to the floor. Dr. Vance, currently filling out Kira's dismissal paperwork with a smug flourish, froze as the ceiling lights began to sway. "What is that? An air ambulance?" he demanded, looking toward the ceiling. "No," Sarah whispered, her face pressed against the glass of the lobby window. It's black. There are no markings." On the roof, the helicopter's skid slammed onto the helipad before the engines had even begun to cycle down. The side door slid open with a synchronized hydraulic hiss. Before the hospital security could even reach the roof access, a dozen men in tactical gear and charcoal gray suits flooded out. They moved with a terrifying, silent precision, rifles held at a low ready. They didn't speak. They simply took the high ground, securing the stairwells and elevators in a matter of seconds. Kira watched from the curb as the hospital's main entrance was swarmed from the outside as well. Black SUVs screeched to a halt, forming a perimeter that choked off the ambulance bay. The security guards who had so recently escorted Kira out now stood paralyzed, their hands raised in the air as they stared into the barrels of weapons that cost more than their yearly salaries. The hospital was no longer a place of healing, it was a fortress under siege. The staff inside huddled together, watching in terror as the elevators in the lobby chimed in unison. The digital displays showed them all descending from the roof at once. Kira didn't move. She knew the choreography of this power. She knew the man who moved at the center of this storm. She watched as the automatic doors of the hospital, the one she had just been forced through in disgrace, were pinned open by two suited enforcers. The atmosphere in the parking lot changed. The frantic noise of the helicopter seemed to fade into a heavy, expectant hush. Kira stood her ground at the bus stop, her bowed shoulders finally straightening, her head lifting to reveal the steel in her gaze. The sky had turned black, but for the first time in 3 years, Kira Davies felt like she could breathe. The dragon had landed, and he had brought the night with him. The lobby of St. Jude's Premier, usually a bastion of hushed voices and expensive marble, was now a theater of absolute, suffocating terror. The automatic doors didn't just slide open, they felt as if they had been conquered. Through the glass, the hospital staff watched in paralyzed silence as a phalanx of suited men formed a corridor of steel, leading from the parking lot to the reception desk. Then, he appeared. Yoon Hyuk-Jin moved with a stillness that was more threatening than any shout. He wore an immaculate black suit that seemed to absorb the clinical glare of the overhead lights, his white shirt crisp enough to cut. Dark sunglasses shielded his eyes, rendering his expression a mask of unreadable, glacial stone. He didn't look like a man visiting a hospital. He looked like the man who had just purchased it and was deciding whether or not to burn it down. Beside him, his second-in-command, a mountain of a man with a jagged scar trailing into his collar, moved with the alert hunger of a wolf. Behind them, the rhythmic boots of tactical soldiers echoed against the high ceilings, a sound that made the hospital's security team retreat until their backs hit the walls. Dr. Sterling Vance stood in the center of the lobby, his face a sickly shade of gray. He tried to summon the practiced arrogance that had served him for years, but in the presence of Hyuk-Jin, his authority felt microscopic, a child playing dress-up in a white coat. He stepped forward, his voice cracking on the first syllable. "Excuse me. Sir, you can't bring armed men into a medical facility. This is a restricted." Hyuk-Jin didn't stop walking. He didn't even turn his head. He simply continued his stride until he was inches from Vance, forcing the doctor to stumble backward. The air around the Mafia boss was cold, smelling of expensive tobacco and the ozone of the storm he had brought with him. "Where is she?" Hyuk-Jin asked. His voice was a low, melodic vibration, devoid of anger but heavy with the weight of an inevitable consequence. Vance swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he shoved them into his pockets. I don't know who you're talking about. We have many patients." "I am not here for a patient," Hyuk-Jin interrupted, his tone sharpening like a blade being drawn from a sheath. He removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that held the terrifying clarity of a predator. He leaned in, his shadow eclipsing Vance entirely. "I am here for my fiancée, Kira Davies. I am told she was escorted out of this building like a criminal. By you." The lobby went deathly quiet. Sarah and the other nurses, who had so gleefully participated in the night's mockery, shrank behind the counter, trying to become as invisible as Kira had once tried to be. They looked at the soldiers, then at the man who had turned the hospital into a war zone just to find a diversity hire. Vance's mouth worked soundlessly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The woman he had called a placeholder, the nurse he had fired to protect his own ego, was the queen of this man's empire. She violated protocol, Vance stammered, his desperation turning his voice into a high-pitched whine. She was insubordinate. I had to maintain order. Hyuk-Jin's hand moved faster than the eye could follow. He didn't strike Vance. He simply gripped the doctor's ID badge, snapping the plastic clip with a violent pop. He held the badge up to Vance's face, his gaze terrifyingly calm. "You talk of order," Hyuk-Jin whispered, "while your hands are shaking. You talk of protocols while my brother is dying in an ambulance because your order failed to recognize the poison in his veins." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level. "You have exactly 60 seconds to bring her back to me. If she is not in this room, the only thing this hospital will be maintaining is a list of its own casualties." The enforcer beside him checked his watch. The metallic click of a rifle being chambered echoed through the lobby, a final, punctuating note. Vance didn't wait. He turned and ran toward the ambulance bay, his expensive loafers skidding on the marble, a broken man chasing the only woman who could save him. The silence in the lobby was so absolute that when the automatic doors hissed open, it sounded like a thunderclap. Dr. Sterling Vance stumbled back into the room, his face drenched in sweat, his hands trembling as he led Kira Davies back into the theater of his humiliation. Kira didn't look like the woman who had been escorted out in disgrace minutes ago. Though she still wore the light blue scrubs and the utilitarian bun, her posture had shifted. She stood tall, her eyes meeting the chaos of the lobby with the weary, focused clarity of a veteran returning to the front. The moment her gaze locked with Hyuk-Jin's, the glacial mask on the Mafia boss's face didn't just crack, it vanished. He moved toward her, his heavy, rhythmic strides eating the distance until he stood directly in front of her. He didn't care about the soldiers, the cowering nurses, or the administrators clutching their phones in the corners. He reached out, his gloved hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man of his reputation. "Kira," he whispered, his voice no longer a threat, but a plea. "Hyuk-Jin," she replied, her voice steady. "What have you done? You can't land a Black Hawk on a civilian hospital. I would have leveled the city to find you," he said, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. But then, the urgency returned to his eyes, a flicker of raw, human fear that he only ever showed to her. "It's Minho. They found him at the docks an hour ago. He's dying, Kira." The same signature as the diplomat. The V-series. Kira's breath hitched. Minho, Hyuk-Jin's younger brother, was the only piece of innocence left in their violent world. "Where is he?" "In the transport out front," Hyuk-Jin said. He turned his head slightly, casting a look of pure loathing at Vance, who was currently trying to regain some semblance of dignity by adjusting his stethoscope. "Let the chief resident see him," Kira said, testing the air. "Vance is the golden boy of St. Jude's. He has the equipment, the staff." "No," Hyuk-Jin cut her off, his voice dropping into a growl that silenced the room. He looked at Vance as if he were an insect beneath a boot. "I have seen what his medicine looks like. I watched the monitors from the roof. He almost killed a man tonight because he was too busy admiring his own reflection to see the truth. I don't want a doctor who needs a title to feel powerful." Hyuk-Jin stepped closer to Kira, his hand moving to the silver chain around her neck, pulling the 5-carat ring into the light. The diamond caught the harsh fluorescent glare, casting sharp, prismatic fractals across the marble floor. "I want the woman who saved me in that basement in Seoul," he said, his eyes burning into hers. "I want the woman who sees what no one else sees. I don't want their protocols or their egos. I want the ghost. I want my fiancé." Kira looked at the ring, then at the terrified staff, and finally at the man who had crossed an ocean of blood to bring her back to herself. The mouse didn't just die. She was incinerated. Kira reached up, her fingers flying to the nape of her neck. With a single, sharp motion, she pulled the pins from her hair. The tight, restrictive bun fell away, her natural curls cascading down her shoulders in a defiant, dark halo. She turned to the room, her presence suddenly so vast that Dr. Vance seemed to physically shrink. "Move his brother to Trauma Bay 1, Kira commanded. It wasn't a request, it was a decree. "Clear the floor. I want a full tox screen kit, 2 units of O-negative on standby, and 10 milligrams of the atropine-oxim cocktail prepped and ready." She looked at Vance, her eyes cold and clinical. "And Dr. Vance, you'll be staying to assist. You wanted to see how a real medic operates. Tonight, you're going to learn." She didn't wait for his answer. She turned and walked toward the ambulance bay, the dragon at her side and the weight of the world on her shoulders. The hospital was no longer Vance's playground. It was Kira's sanctuary, and she was done hiding. The transition from the lobby to Trauma Bay 1 felt like a military breaching operation. Hyuk-Jin's men moved ahead, clearing the corridors with a silent, terrifying efficiency that left the night shift staff pressed against the walls in a state of shock. At the center of the storm walked Kira, her loose curls swaying with every purposeful step, her eyes fixed on the gurney where Minho lay, a young man drowning in his own body. "Into the bay." Now, Kira's voice was a whip crack that galvanized the room. Dr. Sterling Vance scrambled behind her, his face pale and his breathing shallow. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him had turned to glass. As they burst into the sterile, high-intensity light of the trauma room, Kira didn't look for permission. She took her place at the head of the bed, her movements a blur of lethal precision. "He's in full respiratory failure," Kira stated, her hands moving over Minho's chest with clinical grace. She looked at the monitor. The oxygen levels were plummeting into the 50s. "The neurotoxin is paralyzing the diaphragm. He needs to be ventilated, but the seizure activity is making the airway too reactive for the machine to sink." She turned her gaze to Vance, who was standing by the equipment cart, his hands hovering uselessly over a tray of intubation tools. "Dr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "Pick up the ambo bag." Vance blinked, his mouth falling open. "What? That's a technician's job. I should be the one administering the—" "You will do exactly what I tell you," Kira interrupted, her eyes flashing with a cold fire that silenced him instantly. "The machine is too slow. He needs a human touch to feel the resistance in his lungs. You are going to bag him manually. You are going to breathe for him while I neutralize the poison." Vance hesitated, his ego struggling for one last breath of life. But then he felt the presence of Hyuk-Jin standing in the corner of the room, a silent, dark-suited sentinel whose very existence promised a violent end to any further hesitation. With trembling hands, Vance grabbed the blue manual resuscitator and stepped to the head of the bed. "Squeeze, release. Squeeze, release," Kira commanded, her rhythm absolute. Keep his saturation above 85%. If you fail to maintain that rhythm, he'll suffer brain damage before the antidote even hits his bloodstream. Do not stop until I tell you. As Vance began the exhausting, rhythmic labor of manual ventilation, sweat already beginning to bead on his forehead, Kira turned to the medication tray. The mouse had vanished, replaced by the Valkyrie of the Itaewon shadows. She snapped the necks of 3 different vials, mixing a concentrated cocktail of atropine and a specific, off-label chelating agent she had learned to use in the trauma tents of the East. The heart monitor emitted a sharp, erratic screech. Minho's body arched, his muscles locking in a violent, tetanic spasm. He's seizing, Vance cried out, his rhythm breaking. Kira, he's going to. Don't you dare stop bagging, she roared, her voice vibrating the glass of the observation deck. With a supernatural stillness, she found the central line port. She didn't use a local anesthetic. There was no time. She drove the needle home with a precision that would have made a master jeweler weep. As the clear fluid surged into Minho's system, the room seemed to hold its breath. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss-pop of the bag in Vance's hands. Then, the monitor's jagged, panicked lines began to soften. The titanic arch in Minho's back collapsed. The gray, ashen hue of his skin began to dissolve, replaced by a soft, blooming pink. His heart rate is stabilizing, Sarah whispered from the doorway, her voice filled with a reluctant, breathless awe. Kira didn't celebrate. She kept her hand on Minho's pulse, her eyes locked on the monitor until the rhythm was as steady as a drumbeat. She finally looked at Vance, who was panting, his shoulders aching, his expensive lab coat stained with sweat. He looked at Kira not as a diversity hire, but as something far more terrifying, his superior. "You can stop now, Sterling," she said, her voice a calm, cutting blade. "He's breathing on his own. I've done the work. Now you can go back to your paperwork." The heavy silence that followed the stabilization of Minho was far more deafening than the chaos that had preceded it. Kira stood over the bed, the Valkyrie of the shadows gradually settling back into the skin of a woman who had finally found her worth. She looked down at her hands, steady, capable, and no longer needing to hide. Dr. Sterling Vance stood hunched over the gurney, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the manual labor of breathing for a man he had almost allowed to die. He looked up at Kira, his eyes wide and hollow. The arrogance that had sustained his career for years had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who finally understood that his white coat was just fabric, while Kira's scrubs were a suit of armor. I didn't know," Vance stammered, his voice thin and pathetic. "Kira, if you stay, we can discuss a promotion. I'll speak to the board. We can make this right." Kira looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound, chilling pity. "Medicine isn't a platform for your ego, Sterling. It's a sanctuary for the vulnerable. You almost killed 2 men tonight because you couldn't imagine a world where a woman like me was your superior." She reached up to her chest, unpinning the hospital ID badge that bore her name and the title junior nurse. "Keep your promotion. You're going to need it to explain to the board why the woman who actually owns this land is never coming back." She let the badge fall. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, plastic clack, sliding toward Vance's feet. In the doorway, the hospital's board of directors and the chief of medicine stood frozen, their faces drained of color. They had arrived just in time to hear the revelation that the diversity hire they had ignored was the primary beneficiary of the estate that funded their very existence. Hyuk-Jin stepped forward, his presence filling the sterile room like a coming storm. He didn't look at the administrators or the cowering staff. He looked only at Kira. He reached out, offering his arm in a gesture of absolute, public devotion. "The helicopter is waiting, my queen," he said softly, his voice a low vibration that carried through the room. "The world is ready for you to stop hiding." Kira took his arm, her fingers resting lightly on the expensive wool of his suit. As they walked out of the trauma bay, the staff parted like the Red Sea. Sarah, the head nurse, stood pressed against a medication cart, her eyes downcast, unable to meet the gaze of the woman she had mocked for months. Kira didn't offer a parting glance. She was already looking toward the future. They crossed the lobby, passing the shattered remains of the hospital's peace. The soldiers and enforcers fell into formation behind them, a phalanx of shadow protecting the light. As they stepped out into the night air, the roar of the matte black helicopter on the roof began to cycle up, the blades whipping the air into a frenzy. The wind caught Kira's hair, sending her dark curls dancing in the moonlight. She felt the heavy weight of the diamond ring on her hand, no longer hidden beneath a uniform, but shining for the world to see. As they ascended the stairs to the roof, she looked back one last time at the glowing red sign of St. Jude's premiere. She was leaving the mouse behind in the fluorescent-lit hallways. The black ghost was gone too. What remained was a woman who had mastered both the shadows and the light. Hyuk-Jin helped her into the cabin, the door sliding shut with a heavy, final thud. As the helicopter lifted into the sky, banking sharply over the city she had finally conquered, Kira Davies let out a single, steady breath. She wasn't a placeholder anymore. She was the storm. If this story touched your heart or kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you for watching.